Hi, I'm Stanley Goldberg, host of the Inquiring Mind podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And if you're new here, I release 2 episodes a week with a variety of fascinating guests, and I would appreciate if you would support my podcast by liking this video and subscribing down below. Thank you for your support, and now to today's guest. Louis Menand, welcome to the Inquiring Mind podcast.
Thank you.
It's a real pleasure to have you on the podcast. Honestly, I kind of went in reverse. I did not know about your first book, the one that kind of made you, I guess, famous, and that's I have it right here, the Metaphysical Club. It was recommended to me by one of the guests on my podcasts, so I decided to check you out, and then I embarked on this tome, which is your new book, Free World. And I have to say, I don't think I've ever read a book quite like it because it there's so many micro histories and um, mini biographies. There, you learn about so many different characters. You're almost reading fiction, but it's nonfiction, which is kind of the dream when reading a work of nonfiction. Before we get into it, I actually saw a video of yours from about 8 or 9 years ago at Harvard University. You gave a kind of a quick talk. It was a clip on YouTube, and you were talking about writing books for people that are not in academia and the importance of doing that. And you've definitely done that in your 2 books. Why do you think it's so important, and why? Do you think that they're more culturally important than academic books?
No, I think they're complementary to academic books.
Mm,
I think my books are academic enough, that is to say, that scholars who specialize in those areas will take them seriously.
mm,
But as you said, they're designed also to be read by people who are not scholars, who may not know very much about the subject. I think it's important because I work in a university, and it's a huge social investment to create these spaces for people like me to pursue knowledge. And I feel we academics have an obligation to pay back that investment by providing our knowledge in a way that's accessible to society, not just to one another. I think that there's some scholarship that has a very small audience of peers, scholarly peers. I think there's a lot of books that are only read by 200 other people. And I think that's fine because it helps to build up knowledge. But at some point, somebody has to come along and write about that subject in a way that people who are not themselves professors will understand and respond to. So I'm not saying I'm particularly virtuous because I do that. It's just that's the role I happen to play.
right. And when you were starting out in your career, who were the people that influenced you? And when you first realized, oh, I can kind of make a career out of this and writing books and that are accessible to the general public.
No, but there were very few people who did that kind of thing.
Mm,
I went to Columbia Graduate School, and I had a teacher there named Michael Wood, an Englishman who taught at Columbia for a long time, and then ended his career at Princeton. And he wrote quite a bit of magazine stuff, kind of New York Review of Books stuff.
mhm.
And he was also just a great teacher. And he was kind of an inspiration for me. I don't write the way he does, but I felt this is a person who's incredibly knowledgeable about his field was the novel, who also writes very entertaining magazine stuff. So I felt I, I would kind of like to do that. But when I started out, I started teaching in 1980. You know, publications in non-peer reviewed outlets didn't count for much professionally. It wasn't that people didn't care at all about it, but it didn't really add up to a career. So, it was a little hard in the beginning because that's the writing that I always did. But then I think the profession has opened up a bit, particularly recently. It's encouraging more people to do that kind of writing. Um, so it's worked out. It's worked out okay for me. But there weren't a lot of role models in the beginning.
Mhm. And do you enjoy the writing process? So when you sit down to write a book, do you enjoy? Uh, I mean, there's always going to be something that you kind of don't enjoy. I would assume, right? It has to feel like work once in a while. But
Yeah,
is there something do you on the whole, do you enjoy it?
yeah, I do. I mean, the hard part for me is starting. Probably for most writers, just sitting down and forcing yourself to start, and and that's hard for me because the first paragraph is really important for the way I write. So I have to. It takes a while to sort of figure out how that paragraph works and get it right, and then after that, it's pretty enjoyable because I'm just unrolling the carpet that I started with, and it's easy to kind of follow up. I mean, it's time consuming, but it's not hard. The hard part is sort of just beginning the piece to figure out what the shape of it's going to be.
Mhm. So I want to get into your most recent book, The Free World: Art of Thought in the Cold War. Um, right here, one more time. It's again, like I mentioned, you go from George Kennan and foreign policy to the streets of Paris and how all these incredible writers and philosophers mingled on the streets of Paris. And then you go to Hannah Arendt, to George Orwell, to the Beatles, to uh, well, everyone. um, why? Can you explain why did you decide that the Cold War was going to be the backdrop of your book?
Oh, yeah. So just say not everyone. There's a lot of people who are
Yeah,
left out.
yeah.
But it is a very highly populated storybook. I mean, the story has a lot of characters in it. So I picked the Cold War. Uh, you know, it's hard to give a reason, but um, part of it was that I was always been interested in that period, period I was a kid in. I was born in 1952, um, and so I thought I would enjoy plunging back into it and figuring out what was going on. So that was a lot of it. Some of it was feeling that young people, students particularly today, don't know very much about the 50s and 60s, or what they know are kind of cliches. So I thought I was interested in reaching that audience. I don't have trouble reaching an audience of people my age, but I wanted to reach people in their 20s and 30s who are curious to know more about this time. That was part of it. And then when I started it, I really thought the Cold War would be a very determining feature of the story I was trying to tell. And I found that wasn't really the case. I mean, it's there, and it forms a backdrop to stuff, but it's not as though everybody I write about was highly conscious of the Cold War, or that American policy in the Cold War had a large impact or influence on what people art and thought. So that was a little surprising to me, because I realized that there was no through line. In a sense, if the through line was going to be, for example, the CIA's involvement in arts organizations and so forth, it wasn't really there. It wouldn't really get me to where I wanted to go. So then I decided to create what I call vertical cross sections, which is how you described it, which is that each chapter has a particular figure or set of figures. In the first chapter, it's George Kennan and Hans Morgenthau, and then a particular intellectual story, which is the story of international relations theory and the idea of realism, in the context of containment, policy of containment. Then the next chapter does something else. The next chapter does something else. And as I was writing it, I didn't really have a plan until I got partway into it, and I could sort of see the stepping stones that would get me to where I wanted to end up, which was in 1965. Um, so it's not a survey, because it's not encyclopedic. It doesn't cover everything, but it also doesn't have generalizations. It doesn't try to explain why Elvis Presley is like Jackson Pollock. People do that, but I find that very, speculative. So I'm more interested in why Elvis Presley was like Elvis Presley, Jackson Pollock was like Jackson Pollock.
Right. And in the beginning of your book, I can't remember if it's your preface or maybe your first chapter. You mentioned the fact that many people believe that the Cold War was mainly a kind of a military uh, battle between the Soviet Union and the United States, and that's kind of how it was viewed for a long time, and that's definitely a part of it. But I think the main point that you're trying to make is that the war was more of a war of ideas. Am I correct in
Yeah,
this analysis?
it was, yeah, because you know the big part of the story of the Cold War is that it was an arms race, and in a way, that's why it ended when it ended, because we just outspent the Russians. But in the 50s and 60s, it was also a war of art and ideas because we didn't want to get militarily engaged with the Soviets. They didn't want to get militarily engaged with us. So we danced around that issue, but we did a lot of cultural diplomacy. So the U.S. sent a lot of artists and writers abroad, or various organizations in the United States, like the Museum of Modern Art, and the Soviets did the same thing. They sent the Bolshoi Ballet around the world and all that. Why was that? Because both sides were trying to win the hearts and minds of people in unaligned nations, so-called third world, and also intellectuals in Western Europe who were very skeptical of capitalism in the United States. So a lot depended, therefore, on the quality of art and ideas that one of these countries produced because it was being used for propaganda purposes.
Mhm. And again, the general theme in your book, and I think it's the most important one, and it's a very important question to kind of confront, is the theme of freedom, which is part of your subtitle as well. Oh, sorry, your title, the free world. And why is freedom so important to you and important to this time period?
Well, it's important to the time period because it's the slogan of the liberal democracies. This is that we have a free society. So just to take the example of art, um, in the Soviet Union, that was an official aesthetic, socialist realism. And if your work was not what the Stalinists would have considered appropriate uh, work within the domain of socialist realism, then didn't get distributed, didn't get printed. It was censored. You were sent to the gulag. Your work wasn't performed. So everybody knew this about the Soviet Union. It wasn't a big secret. So the United States, in particular, but liberal democracies in general, wanted to promote the idea that there is no official aesthetic in our countries because you're free to express yourself any way that you want. You can make an abstract painting, you can make a representational painting, you can paint a soup can. It's fine with us because we're the free world. The state doesn't tell you what to write or what to paint or how to compose music, which the state did do in communist countries. So that was the main message in the propaganda Cold War was that the United States was a society where it had freedom of expression. Interestingly, in order to live up to that claim, because it wasn't completely true, the United States had to do all kinds of things to show that we actually were not censoring people, including changing obscenity law to allow books to be published that had language in them that would have been illegal before the Supreme Court decided to change the definition of the First Amendment. So expansion of First Amendment protections is consistent with the Cold War policy.
Mhm. And it's interesting that in the beginning of your book, you, again, when discussing this idea of freedom, after World War II, the Soviets kind of cranked down on Western ideas and people that were susceptible to kind of Western thoughts in their countries, and they would send them to the gulag or whatever they would do. And
Yeah,
then in the United States, you had kind of the opposite without the gulags and stuff, but you would have uh, people that were accused of being communists and stuff like
right,
that
right.
shut down uh, or I think at times in prison. So why was it this? Why were these two countries? I mean, the Soviet Union, you kind of expect this to be the case. Why was the U.S. following the Soviet Union's footsteps
Yeah,
in that way?
yeah. The whole Cold War is a looking glass war. Everything they did, we did, and vice versa. I mean, it's really kind of amazing. If you just put two timelines, Soviet actions and U.S. actions, together, it's just amazing how much we copy them and they copy us. So you picked out one of the ways that that's true, which is the crackdown on Westernization and Stalinist Russia, Stalinist Soviet Union after 1945 is exactly paralleled by the crackdown on dissident opinion, or in particular communism in the United States. And it's a little worse for people in the Soviet Union than here, but people lost their jobs. Some people did go to jail. A lot of people exiled themselves. People were shut down. So it did. That stops around 1956, but in the first 10 years of the Cold War, that's definitely a feature of the American landscape. As you say, it's not consistent with our propaganda claims to be a society that tolerates freedom of expression. Because if we're if we're silencing people because we don't like their political ideas, then we can't make that claim.
Do you think that what you just said applies to the present in any way? Because again, if you just draw a timeline or a line through parallel lines between, say, Russia today and then the United States today,
Yeah,
Russia still shuts down speech that is contrary to government opinion or government policy or whatnot,
yeah,
and they still put people in prison. And then you have the United States where you don't necessarily go to prison, but you have trial public opinion by public opinion on Twitter or these social media channels.
yeah.
So, do you feel like uh, that still applies to the world today, where people get shut down and are not allowed to talk?
Yeah, I wouldn't equivalate. I wouldn't um, make equivalent the Russian and Chinese suppression of speech
Right.
with Twitter. Um, but I would say this, that even in the United States, people are always trying to get other people to shut up. It's just the nature of speech. If I don't like something that you're saying, I don't want you to say it again. And I don't have legal means to prevent that usually, but I have other means to prevent it, which is discrediting you or turning off your Zoom or whatever. And people do that because people don't like to tolerate expressions that they find abhorrent. But it's always been true. It's always going to be an arena, the First Amendment or freedom of expression generally, in which people do battle with each other and try to prevail. Um, so that's the one thing about the United States that distinguishes it from these other countries is that we have the First Amendment as part of the Constitution, and that prohibits the state from silencing you. Um, and it doesn't mean other people can't try to silence you, but it means the state can't do that. That's huge because lots of other countries, just the state can play that role. So that's it's a valuable right, and I think most Americans want to preserve it as long as the people they don't like shut up.
Yeah. And do you feel like that free speech? I mean, this is an observation I made. I don't know if I'm right, but free speech went from being uh, m- more defended by people on the left
Yeah,
than now it's more defended by people on the right.
right. Yeah.
Where when did that shift kind of occur in your opinion?
I think it's pretty recent, really. So you're right that the language of liberty and freedom was kind of a liberal or left wing language in the '60s, and now it's kind of a right wing language. So I I mean, in a way, everybody uses the language of freedom no matter what. George Wallace used it, the segregationist. Barry Goldwater used it, libertarian conservative. John Kennedy used it. Martin Luther King Jr. used it. Everybody used it. So in a way, it's kind of meaningless. But insofar as it deals with this concept that individual liberties are being somehow abrogated by state policy, or the campus thought police or whatever it is, tends to be a right wing slogan. Um, I would just say that, I mean, I'm a liberal, obviously. I teach at Harvard, and I'm an English professor. But I would say that the people who feel wearing a mask impinges on their liberty, that's a real feeling that they have. I mean, I don't respect their reasons, but I get that they feel somehow something's been taken away from them, some autonomy. I would feel the same way if somebody told me there's a book I can't teach. I would feel outraged that my freedom was being um, eroded. So it's very important to people that feeling is very important to human beings. I think every human being wants to feel that way to some extent, and you have to respect that as a society because you're in trouble if a lot of people feel that their freedoms are being abrogated.
Yeah, you just mentioned the fact that Martin Luther King and people with Kennedy and George Wallace used this word freedom, and famously Martin Luther King had let freedom ring, and
Yeah,
into in in the I Have a Dream speech he uses freedom, I don't know how many times,
many
probably 20
times.
times. um and I always felt like when you study American history, it's always especially for Martin Luther King, it was an appeal to America's better angels and saying, look, we were promised a certain set of ideals that we're not fulfilling at the moment. Uh, Please, let's change this. And it was his appeal through nonviolence and other means, and of saying, we're a free society. It appealed to white people in the South and all over the place to
Yeah.
say, what, we have to change some things. I feel like that's not a again, maybe I'm wrong, but it's not a sentiment shared these days where if politicians speak, they don't really say the word freedom. That's not a big priority for them.
Yeah.
Do you think that's the case, or am I wrong in my analysis?
No, I think politicians believe in freedom. The, the king, what the king example shows is that there's a tension between freedom and equality. Because really, what the civil rights movement wanted was equality. It wasn't exactly freedom. I mean, they weren't locked up. They were just treated as second-class citizens, and so they wanted to be treated equally. But King didn't use that language, and I don't know what his reasoning was, but I think because he felt that Americans associate equality with redistribution, and that's not going to be something a lot of politicians want to get behind. But everybody can get behind the concept of freedom. So that's the language that he used, and it worked because people like John Kennedy thought that way. John Kennedy was not interested in redistribution. He was interested in this ideal. So I think that's why you see it everywhere, because it has enormous currency in American political life.
Right. And how do again, on the topic of freedom, when why do you think freedom is so important, and why should it be valued today, and um or should it be valued today?
It's really important to us as a species because we're not herd animals. We're not biologically determined. We have minds and we can make choices. And I think all human beings want to feel that they're making choices for themselves at some level. Obviously, a lot of choices we make are dictated to us, but we want to feel, in certain contexts, we want to feel this is a choice that we've freely made. I just think it's just something that people feel, and that's why I think you have to respect it, because everybody feels it. The problem is that people feel it for different reasons, and people associate freedom with different sets of conditions. So it's hard to come up with a system in which everybody feels equally free, because just a lot of contesting about it. But ideally, that's how you would feel in a liberal democracy: is that as an individual, you have freedoms that are protected by the state, um, and against other people.
Right. And do you think that in the United States, can the United States succumb to totalitarianism? Um, are they as likely to succumb to totalitarianism as, say, a country like, I don't know, Germany in the 1940s, or the Soviet Union and stuff like that? Or is
Yeah,
it not in our kind of
I don't,
DNA?
I can't answer that question. I
Yeah.
mean, I would be wrong if I guessed either way, probably. I mean, I think people in the 1950s thought we could become totalitarian because a lot of people worried that was just the future. That's what 1984 is about. The novel is not about communism, it's about the future for everybody. The whole world lives in a totalitarian state. And Orwell, I mean, that's a satire, but Orwell was worried that if we keep going in the direction that we're going, that we could end up there. Hannah Arendt worried about that when she wrote The Origins of Totalitarianism about the same time as Orwell's novel. So that was a concern that a lot of people had in the 50s, particularly, that could happen here. Could it happen here today? It's hard to say. I think authoritarianism is not a remote possibility because that's just a strong leader. That's who Trump tried to be. Basically, he said, "I don't care about the election. I'm going to be the leader." And a lot of countries works that way. I think surprising a lot of people went along with that, which is alarming.
Right. Uh, Hannah Arendt, in your book, she had a good. There was a good quote from, uh, I think the preface of her book, or when and I'm going to read it: "To succumb neither to the past nor the future, what matters is to be entirely present." And her book was meant to be a way to judge the present.
Right.
So, and is it very important for people to know history in order to judge the present?
So I'm a historian, and I don't think so. So um, I think that history doesn't give us very clear lessons because all situations are different. What we tend to do is we isolate one variable in the past and then compare it to the same variable today. But we're holding all these other things constant, which have all changed as well. So you have a political situation, you have a military situation, you have an economic situation, you have a demographic situation, you have a technological situation. All those things are going to create whatever it is that happens historically. You can't reproduce that. It just, doesn't repeat itself. So you're just looking at a different ball of wax each time you look at a historical moment. So I'm not a person who thinks that there's a huge amount to learn in a practical way from looking at what happened historically. Look, in the First World War, everybody in Europe got into the war too fast. The Second World War, they got in too slow. What was the right thing to do? You couldn't judge from the first example what we do in the second example. It was a different set of characters, a different set of social conditions. So anyway, I think that's generally true. What's I find is useful historically is to, I would just say, feel inspiration by what people were able to accomplish. Um, and I think that's important in its own way. It's not a lesson that we learn. It's more an example of what's possible, and that can be very exciting and inspirational.
Yeah, but wouldn't you say that, yes, history doesn't directly repeat itself? There's the famous quote that I never know who said. It's history doesn't repeat itself. It just rhymes.
Oh,
Or yeah. So um
that's what Hannah Arendt thought. It rhymed.
yeah, but again, so beyond feeling inspiration from history, and obviously you can look back at historical figures like, I don't know, Churchill, or um, a lot of people look at Kennedy and stuff like that, and they find inspirational words or actions, and then they themselves take action in their lives. Do you then why have people taught for a long time when you teach a history class that you have to kind of learn to apply history to the current day? So is that completely false logic in
Well,
teaching it
so
that way?
yeah, I mean, if you ask me, can I learn how to deal with a contemporary problem by looking at a past similar problem, I would say beware. If you said to me, can history tell us why we ended up where we are? Yeah, ideally, if it's done well. So if you know the backstory to current arrangements, you have a much different sense of how inevitable, natural, or necessary they are. Because you can see how certain things emerged the way they did because of historically contingent circumstances. So just to give an example of my own business, which is higher education, the contemporary university, American university, arises in the late 19th century. And it still bears many of the features of late 19th century thinking, which are quite outmoded today, but it's baked into the institutional structure that we work in. So it helps to know how that structure arose and what interests it served when it was first put into place to understand whether we need to keep doing it the same way now. And that's true of pretty much every social arrangement that we encounter. It happens to be that way because of something that happened in the past, and therefore it's good to know why what happened and why it turned out the way that it did. Put it a slightly different way, because you feel this when you're teaching college students a lot, is that most people take the world they're born into for granted. We just assume this is the way it's naturally supposed to be. In fact, the older we get, the more we think, yeah, the world we were born in was the way it's supposed to be. I wish it was that way again. But it's not you shouldn't take it for granted because there's nothing natural or inevitable about it. It's just a consequence of certain, historical forces. So history helps people get that perception of the nature of reality, and that's what liberal education is meant to teach people.
Right. People on that I've had on the podcast as well. There was a historian I had on the podcast who teaches at a CUNY in New York, and he's a World War II historian, and he wrote a book called The Death of Democracy. His name is Benjamin Hett, and he kind of compared how Hitler came to power and how potentially it could be a danger in the world we live in today in the United States, and how maybe, I mean, you have to read between the lines a little bit, but it's uh, how maybe Donald Trump tried to come to power and stay in power. And and then there are a lot of people, for example, that say, oh, well, shutting down people on Twitter or shutting down people on Instagram or whatnot is what the Bolsheviks did. And it's that. So you can't, can you compare it that way? Like behaviors are very similar to what other totalitarian regimes did?
Sure.
Or,
Yeah. I just think that dealing with Hitler and dealing with Trump are two different things.
oh, correct.
Yeah, that's all. You're not going to learn how to deal with Trump because of what we should have done to Hitler, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
Right. So, but yeah, of course there's parallels. Yeah, I mean, we're human beings. We tend to reproduce certain situations all the time. I'm not denigrating history. Your first question had to do with, is there a lesson from the past? And I said I'm always skeptical of that.
Okay. And in your book, again, one of the central themes is you talk a lot about art and in and the importance of freedom to art, especially. What were the major differences between art in the United States during the Cold War and then totalitarian or authoritarian art, as some would call
Yeah. Um, it just has to do with this concept of socialist realism. So with that concept meant, I think it meant two things basically. This is the sort of Stalinist ideology of aesthetic ideology. One is that the works of art should represent the history of the class struggle, because that's the reality, Marxist reality. And the second is that it be accessible to the people, so that if ordinary people dislike it or don't get it, it's not good art, it's coterie art. Um, so what gets ruled out are both avant-garde styles, which can be difficult for people, sort of ordinary people, to kind of get or get pleasure out of. And also what's out is individual expression, bourgeois individualism. So subjectivism, aestheticism, avant-gardism are pretty much cut out of Soviet culture. And that's a big change from the 20s, when Soviet culture was very, and before the revolution, when Soviet culture was very avant-garde, of avant-garde poetry, art, and film. And Stalin basically shuts all that down. So that's a pretty, that's a softball thrown to the United States, because it's pretty easy to show that we don't have any aesthetic that's limiting in that way. If you want to make murals portraying the class struggle, we're fine with that. If you want to write poetry expressing your personal feelings, we're fine with that too. So as I say, that becomes a very important part of uh, American propaganda. So the consequence of that is that everything really matters, because if you're saying in the United States you can produce art in any way that you want, it has to be good. Because if the result of that permissiveness is crap, then you're losing the fight. So a lot depends on making sure that the art that's produced under the conditions of liberal democracy is actually high quality art. And that's why people get into fights about abstract painting and beat literature and various
it.
kinds of poetry and so forth, because it really matters that this stuff be good. Um, it doesn't matter to us anymore in that way. We don't. Nothing turns on it whether it's really good or not. We don't think like, oh, the United States is not producing great poetry. We just think it's producing all kinds of poetry. That's all fine. It's a much flatter sort of cultural field today, but in the 50s and 60s, stuff really mattered for that reason.
Yeah, that kind of leads me to one of my next questions, and that's when reading a book like this, I think it's almost natural to look to the current day and go, well, if I were to write a book about the same kind of book about the last 20 years of American history, who are the cultural figures, who are the philosophers, psychologists, psychiatrists, writers, poets, whatever, um, that shaped the modern world or the 21st century or the beginning of the 21st century?
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
I gotta tell you, I struggled quite a bit. I was trying to figure out who was the philosopher of our time, but I don't know if it's still the same as it was in the 50s and 60s, because I feel like a lot of these people had almost cult-like followings, and people followed
yeah.
these writers and they bought their books. While today people read people's books and buy people's books, I don't know if there are a few philosophers that kind of like shape the time.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I sometimes ask that question. Who would be in your book if you wrote it about the last 20 years? I can't answer partly because I just don't know, don't know everything that's out there, so I wouldn't really know who to pick. But part of it, I think you're right, is that there are not exactly monumental figures. Whereas in this earlier period, 70 years ago, there were these kind of iconic or monumental figures that everybody had to grapple with, like Jackson Pollock or Norman Mailer or Susan Sontag. And we don't really have that right now. There's a lot of interesting writers, obviously, thinkers, artists, musicians, and so on. There's a lot of great product, but it's not as though everybody has to kind of get Beyonce or whatever it might be. So that's an interesting change, I think, that we don't produce iconic cultural figures or culture heroes in the way that happened back then. It's a more diverse cultural environment, but as I say, in a way it's kind of flatter.
Yeah, well, again, to that point, what I found interesting is one of my favorite chapters that you had in your book, and I was in love with it. I think I took notes upon notes upon notes. Was the chapter about Paris and during World War II,
Yeah,
or before the Second World War, during the war, and then after, and the amount of these kind of names that everyone knows. Well, not okay, not everyone knows everyone, but for the most part, the Hemingways and people like that. And again, I live in New York, which is technically the cultural center of the world. And I start to I'm thinking, who are the let's set aside the thinkers, the writers that kind of grab people's imaginations. And I think if you go maybe in the 90s or the 80s, there was that kind of postmodern period of maybe Thomas Pynchon, and then you have David Foster Wallace, people like that that kind of
yeah.
were so different from whatever came before. Uh, do you have? I know it's difficult, but do you have any kind of fiction writers or writers from the last 25 years that you go, okay, that's in the mountaintop of American literature?
Not really. So not really. I mean, I think David Foster Wallace is maybe the last one of those writers who had that kind of stature. Uh, all my students read David Foster Wallace 15 years ago, 20 years ago. It's hard to say after that. There's just a lot of different. There's just a lot of different writers. They all have followings of various kinds, but as you say, it's not like, oh, this is where the novel is today. What this person is doing. They tend to they they tend to have sort of, I wouldn't say they're not fads exactly, but they have a fairly short shelf life. For example, uh, Karl Ove Knausgaard. 15 years ago, everybody was talking about his whatever it is, 5 volumes of his memoir, um, and then people stopped talking about it. And now you wouldn't say, "Oh, Knausgaard is important, an inescapable
Yeah.
figure in 21st century cultural history. He's just one of many writers." So, that's a normal life cycle of a cultural phenomenon. It's about 3 or 4 years anyway. But what's interesting is that they don't seem to last beyond that. Whereas in the earlier period, there's Jackson Pollock and Norman Mailer and Jean-Paul Sartre and James Baldwin and Susan Sontag and Andy Warhol. They're still iconic to us. We look back at it, they represent a whole way of thinking or a
Yeah.
whole way of painting or a whole way of writing. And we don't, it's not, that's really not quite true today. But to answer your questions, I don't know why that's so. Some of it may just be you need about 20 years distance, or at least historically,
Mhm.
to be able to kind of understand, your own moment. When you're in the moment, it's very hard to make sense of it because you're inside the fishbowl.
Yeah. And uh, again, one of the similarities people always point at, for example, with James Baldwin, people compare, say, a Ta-Nehisi Coates currently to James Baldwin. I don't think there's much of a similar. In my opinion, I've read Ta-Nehisi Coates, I've read James Baldwin. I don't see the. I mean, I see the similarities, but I don't at the same time. Um, But again, Ta-Nehisi Coates had his moment, right? Like when he published his
Yeah,
first book, the I forgot what it's called.
World and May.
Yeah, the right, Between the World and Me. There you go. And that was a cultural moment, I guess, and he was really big for that. And then years go by, and then you kind of don't hear about Ta-Nehisi Coates as much, even though he has a new book out, and
Yeah.
I get people buy it and people still read it, but it's not the same as it used to be. Maybe it's our attention spans with social media and stuff that we just kind of jump from thing to thing.
But that's true of the earlier period too. There are sort of um, very important books that have kind of short shelf life.
Right.
I give you The Greening of America. You probably don't remember, know that book by Charles Wright. Came out in 1970. It was sort of a book about the counterculture. He was a law professor at Yale. Sort of book about the counterculture and sort of raising consciousness in America and stuff. It was a huge hit. I mean, I read it when I was in college. Nobody reads it now. So there's lots of the population bomb. You know, there's lots of books that are topical, and everybody talks about them for a couple of years, and then those writers may continue to write, but they're no longer at the center of culture's attention.
Right. Um, One interesting question again, when I was reading your book, how did you do the research for the book, and how do you touch on such wide-ranging topics
Yeah.
and you go, okay, these connect somehow? Or did you just write one chapter at a time and you go, oh, what will go well after this, and then that, and then, or did you kind of do the research first and then um, put it all together?
No, it's what you just said. I went chapter by chapter, and I researched each chapter and wrote each chapter independently. Um, and I didn't go back and change. I didn't go back and revise them, which is just the way I write anyway. And then I kind of tried to find the stepping stones that would get me to 1965, which is where I knew I wanted to end. So I had a rough idea of where I wanted to end. In the beginning, I didn't have quite an idea of why I wanted to end there, but eventually it emerged.
Mm.
And I just tried to follow the material and let the material dictate how I wrote it. So it's a little unusual book, as I think you started by saying, because it covers a lot of stuff, but not in a survey manner. So you actually spend a lot of time with Jasper Johns or Allen Ginsberg, and you ideally really get a feel for what they're what they were about and what their moment was about before you go to the next thing. And then I don't try to to show that there's connections. I just try to let the reader get a feel for the way that these ideas evolve over the 20-year period.
And I think, like anything, when writers write a book, it's really important what you put into the book, but it's also, in my opinion, important what you leave out.
Yeah.
Did you leave something out of the book that you wish people
Yes.
knew about, or no?
Yeah. The chapter. So there's. I mean, if I could write another 20 chapters, probably I
Feel
could.
free.
Yeah. No, I'm not gonna
I
take
know.
a long time to do this book. But there's plenty. I could write about the history of academic economics, which is obviously very important in that period. I could write about jazz, which I didn't write about, which is important in that period. So there's lots of stuff. But the chapter I wanted to write didn't get to write, just didn't have space for it, is on Japan, because there's a lot of, I'm particularly interested in international exchanges of culture and ideas in the period. When people immigrate or when people travel and pick up stuff and bring it back and transform it. So a lot of the culture of the period is transnational in that way. And one of the countries that was very connected to the New York art scene was Japan, which had a very avant-garde art scene, even in the late 1950s, before really it came to the United States. Some of that styles of art, and a lot of Japanese artists came here, performed here, created here, and quite a lot of American avant-gardists went to Japan. There was a lot of interest in their work in Tokyo. So, and then that's in the context, of course, of the United States rebuilding Japan, which was pretty much wiped out at the end of the Second World War into this enormous economic powerhouse. So that's a great story. For context, there's a lot of good characters in it. I just couldn't get to it.
So to begin wrapping up a little bit in the interest of time, I ask two questions of all my guests at the end of every podcast. I bundle them together, and you can answer in whatever order you please. So the first question is, what gives you hope for the future? It's a very either general answer or specific, whatever you prefer. And then the second question is, what are five books, fiction or nonfiction, that you would recommend to people?
Uh, so the future. It's just, I think, like most historians, I don't think about the future very much because we don't predict the future, but we predict the present. We try to explain based on what happened in the past how we got to where we are now. And when you see how difficult that is to do, line up the dots, you realize it's impossible to predict what's going to happen tomorrow. So, what gives me hope? Um, I think we're in the United States anyway. We're on a bit of a knife edge, so that it's possible that under Biden, American government will kind of reinvent itself and become an institution that actually helps people in big ways, or he could lose, and we could go back to where we've been for the last 4 or 5 years, which would be depressing. But I think I feel somewhat hopeful about that. Um, 5 books, yeah. Um, so I think I could probably think of three anyway.
They don't have to be your favorite. They can be
No, no,
some
no,
just
no.
books
These are
you
books
recommend.
I think people might be interested in reading. So one is an old book, a book that I write about, published in 1955. It's called Tris Tropiques. It's by Claude Lévi-Strauss, who was a French anthropologist. And he went to Brazil when he was young in the 1930s and took some expeditions into the interior to meet indigenous peoples, different tribes, and as an anthropologist, did field work with them. And then after the war, he used this material influenced by ideas that he took from linguistics to create the field called structural anthropology. It's a very important moment in intellectual history because cultural anthropology then replaces physical anthropology as an explanation for human difference. So physical anthropologists looked at, for example, things like skull size and so on to show that some races were superior to others. That's why they were different. And cultural anthropology says human difference is a function of culture. We're different because we have different cultures. We're not because we're not biologically, we're not different. That's very important in a decolonizing world. So when Levi-Strauss is working on this in 1955, he writes a book called Tris Tropiques, which is a memoir of his experiences in Brazil um, and kind of his life, with a lot of reflections on the Anthropocene. So Levi-Strauss was a big believer that the human species is going to occupy the planet for a very short time, um, and that for various reasons will just die out. And he saw all human life in that context. So we think about that a lot today for obvious reasons having to do with climate change and COVID and so on. So it's an incredibly well written book. It's a beautiful book. So I would recommend it. Also, it's a great introduction to structural anthropology if you're interested in that. A book that I uh, read in the process of writing my book is a memoir by a dancer named Carolyn Brown, who danced with Merce Cunningham Dance Company. So Merce Cunningham was the partner of John Cage, the avant-garde composer, and Cunningham was a dancer and choreographer, and he created very avant-garde dances and founded his company in I think 1953, and she danced with him for 20 years. They traveled all over the world, became very influential dance company. And this is it's the only thing I think she's ever written. It's a memoir, quite long actually, about her experiences with Cunningham's dance company. And I just thought it was great. And I didn't know very much about dance when I started to work on this, so it was not like I knew that world at all. But it's a wonderful book. So it's called Chance and Circumstance by Carolyn Brown. I can recommend a little bit more briefly two books that are kind of about the same period that I write about. One is called Post-War by historian Tony Judd, J-U-D-T. It came out about 10 or 12 years ago. It's a history of Europe after 1945 up to the time he wrote the book, pretty much, or up to the 21st century. And it's basically covers all the European countries. It's kind of amazing in that way. It's a very big book. And the theme of it has to do with Europe's coming to terms with what had happened during Hitler, the Holocaust, the rise of totalitarianism and Nazism, and so on. And his idea is that it took about 20 years or so for Europeans to kind of finally come to a reckoning with that experience, because of course on continental Europe, most of those countries were occupied by the Nazis, and there were many collaborators. And a lot of people ignored the Holocaust, didn't want to talk about it after the war. So that's the theme of the book, but it's also incredible social, political, and economic history of Europe. And a second book that I really like is a biography by Blake Gopnik of Andy Warhol. It's called Warhol. Came out, I think, about 2 years ago. It's really a terrific book. He did a huge amount of research. The thing about Warhol is that a lot of what people know about him is gossip, because he lied all the time himself, and he didn't care if people lied about him. So there's just this huge tissue of fabrication that surrounds this person and what he was trying to do. And Blake Gopnik sort of gets to the bottom of all these stories of whether they're true or not. Did he really say in the future we'll all be famous for 15 minutes? Probably not. But, that's attributed to him by everybody. So I thought it was a terrific book that needed to be written. And I think a lot of scholars particularly should be grateful to Blake Gopnik for that book. It's called Warhol. So I need one more book, isn't that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh,
You can leave it at 4 if you want.
no, no, I feel this is an opportunity for me to talk about a book. Oh, well, so during the during the lockdown, as it were, like everybody else, I spent a lot of time at home, and I had a lot of time to read. And actually, in my life, I've done very little recreational reading because either I'm writing something or I'm teaching something. But this is an opportunity to read books that just for pleasure. And one book I read for great pleasure, actually three books, but it's a trilogy by Hilary Mantel about Thomas Cromwell, who was Henry VIII's sort of Lord Chancellor. I think everybody knows these books probably, and you may know them also because one volume, really 2 volumes, was adapted for a TV series. It's called Wolf Hall, starring Mark Rylance, who's just unbelievably great in the part of Thomas Cromwell. So I'm curious. I'm interested in Tudor porn, and I was interested in reading the books because I enjoyed Wolf Hall so much. And it's incredible, powerful writing. It's just amazing work of historical reimagination of this time in the 16th century. You really feel like this is what it was like. And it's very colorful. It's very funny. It's very dramatic. So if you haven't read them, first one's called Bringing Up the Bodies. There's 3 of them. I enjoyed it a lot.
Awesome. I wanted to thank you again for coming onto the podcast and for speaking with me and for writing this book, which I highly, highly, highly recommend. I think it's exceptional and it's unusual, and you'll be doing a lot of Google searches throughout the book.
All
So
right. Thank you,
thank you
Sam.
for writing. Yeah.
Thank you.